Grow your practice, grow your wealth, grow your impact. Find out how to spend less time in the dental chair and more time on the things you love.
Welcome back to the Dental Well podcast. Always glad to have you back. Glad to have you here for another episode. Last episode, I let Matthew pick the subject. I kind of liked how that went down. So we'll let you do it again. Pick whatever you want. This is like, I should have everybody who's listening just send in. We'll get thousands of questions,
Yes.
but like just send your question and I'll just answer it like live on the air. I'll be more than happy to.
Let me go through my mini pages of questions here and pick the best one. Now, most recently, I've had some questions. I get a lot of feedback from some of our doctors and from doctors just calling in to Tower Leadership, and they're looking to grow. Okay, they might be a $1.2 million practice that they can't produce anymore. So what do we do next? And they think, should we go purchase another practice? Should we start from scratch and buy a piece of land? Do I do multiple practices, or should I just do like one location and have a bunch of ops? So my question to you is, what are the advantages, disadvantages of either, having multiple locations or a single location? And if you had a preference, what would that preference be?
There's a lot packed into what you just said. So let's unpack it a little bit. So, it's interesting when I think about multiple locations. I remember a day where I was with a client and we drove to 7 locations in one day. Mm-hmm. And I remember the drive from each location to the next. It's an exhausting trip to go to 7 locations in one day.
Yeah.
Here's my question. I would actually go back and unpack this a little differently, which is to say, why do you want multiple locations? And so when we look at that, what ends up happening, and the first thing I would check is ego. Mm-hmm. Okay. And let me explain what I mean by that. Sometimes multiple locations is like this ego thing. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of cool. Like the thing is what we want, and I talked about it a few episodes, we want social capital. In other words, when we talk to somebody else, we want to sound cool. And in fact, we want to sound better than them, right? And so we talk to our dental friends. And sometimes what we want to be able to do just to sound more important is to say, I have 2 locations. Yep. Now, interestingly enough, you might have 3 locations and then they're doing as much as you or more in one location. But there's something that sounds good about saying multiple locations. So my first question would be, why do you want multiple locations? Is it really tactical or is it ego? Mm-hmm. Because I have found many times in all the years I've been doing this, for instance, I think I've shared the example in this podcast before where a group of doctors came to me from Florida and they had built 9 locations. And then ultimately when we unpacked their financial goals, and I sat down with all 3 of them and I said, hey, look, what is it you really want to accomplish? And we did that. They actually wanted 1 location with 24 operatories. 24 operatories is what we would need for them to hit the goals, bring in the associates, be able to pull back, live the life they wanted. And so, and I said to them, wouldn't it have been great if we had this conversation, 8 practices ago? Yeah. And so what happened is they ended up getting a bunch of locations because they thought that was what you do to grow. Mm-hmm. And ultimately speaking, you get what you measure. So if ultimately you're measuring locations, you'll get locations. But there's oftentimes what ends up happening is when somebody who hasn't built out the systems properly and they haven't built out a repeatable type process, they get the second location and the second location ends up not being treated the way it deserves, right? So it's like one master mothership, right? That's doing really well. And then the other one who is kind of like the one that doesn't get the focus and energy. Ultimately speaking, you have to look at your business and say, do I have the processes and systems that I can duplicate? Mm-hmm. The idea of multiple locations is oftentimes duplication of a process. We call that scalability in business. Do I have enough scalable process to duplicate? Because if you don't, then that's also can hinder your ability to grow, because the last thing you want to do is have a practice that's highly profitable, highly successful, and then move to the second location, not give it the effort and desire it needs. Mm-hmm. You bought it maybe because you thought it was a fire sale, but you realized that you didn't get a deal. You got a lot of problems is what you bought. Yep. And then ultimately speaking, you wake up and while before you were sleeping great, now you're stressed out all night long and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to keep this thing from going down? And in fact, we've had plenty of examples of clients that have come to Tower Leadership who were in that situation.
Yeah.
Now, we ultimately fixed that second location, and oftentimes that second location will overtake the first.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it does say, like, why did you do it? Is it just because the idea of an ego-driven, or was it actually some type of a true focus and energy around a strategy?
Yeah.
I would argue many times it's ego.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I'm not beating up anyone for ego. Like, I mean, we all have an ego to some degree.
What would you want?
But I'm just saying, like, why are you doing it? So I think that's an important thing for anyone to analyze. And by the way, the first thing when I say ego, the first thing anyone naturally does is go, I don't have an ego. Like, it's almost like having an ego saying I don't have an ego.
Yeah.
So it's like the first thing you do is like a defensive and like, no, it's not about that. Well, if you actually start looking intrinsically, you might find
if
it
you can't answer the question, why do you have 2 locations, then it might be that.
You know, one thing I'm really good at is helping people build multiple locations. And grow a scalable business. But for me, when I'm coaching somebody to grow that significantly, then ultimately I'm still trying to figure out why. And it comes down to reason. One of the reasons why people get into multiple locations is because they don't have good advice. Mm-hmm. Let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the things that I tell you on this podcast is I'm really strong at is capital management, right? Where do we invest capital? What's the best return? How do we get the best return? Where does it make the most sense? And so what ends up happening is if you look at the marketplace, when you say, I'm going to build a second location, what happens is the supply rep goes, oh, yes. The broker goes, oh, yes. Mm-hmm. The banker goes, yes. And the financial advisor is thinking eventually you can sell all this stuff off and they can get a big check. Oh, yes. And so like when you say second location, everybody else hears one thing, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Mm-hmm. And so they're not actually in a position. And that's why, by the way, a lot of times this happens is because I want a second location and everybody else hears money signs and they go, oh, that sounds great. Yeah. And to give them a little bit of support, they don't have the financial acumen to coach the doctor on what makes the most sense. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times, it's like I was telling someone the other day, we were talking about brokers, and I said the problem with brokers is they have no they don't care what happens after that sale. Mm-hmm. They could care less if they sell your practice, and then all of a sudden you go off into a life of poverty, not their problem. Yeah. Your financial life is not a broker's problem. Their job is to get it sold. Mm-hmm. What happens after that is not their concern.
Yeah. Get the deal done.
So the same thing happens when you're going to acquire practices. Mm-hmm. Now, why am I telling you all this? I'm saying is you need to understand as a CEO of your dental practice and your what you're building or DSO or whatever you have, that there is a ego part of this, and then there's literally a financial goal of every single person to get you into another location.
Yeah.
And that's why these people come to me and they're struggling with their second location because they were set up by a system that didn't really support business and business growth and business development. It wasn't done for the right reasons, and it wasn't done from looking at a capital position economically, what makes the most sense. They weren't looking at the debt service, they weren't looking at the leverage, and they weren't looking about whether we should use debt or equity. They didn't have that conversation. And so ultimately speaking, we need to look at those things first. Does this actually make sense? Now, having one location, and here's the third part. Let me just kind of jump at this too. I think there's another part of this is people tell themselves a story, okay? So you have one location. So I had a doctor. I'll use an example. Actually, a story might be better. So doctor tells me, like, I'm going to be at this price point in this market, and I'm worried about outgrowing my market. How many patients? So we looked at her operatories, and I looked at how many patients we could see during a day. And then we looked at if we maximize that capacity, and then we looked at the average revenue. And so what we did is we calculated if she maxed out the entire facility, how many patients she could see. And then we annualized it. And then what we did is we actually pulled census data from her town and her area. Yeah. For her to hit her highest goal ever, I mean, I'm talking about more than patients she could possibly see. I mean, literally busting at the seams would be 3% of the total population in the area. Yeah. Okay. So when you think about that, it's like sometimes people go move to the next location because they have told themselves a story. One of the reasons they're not getting more patients is because of the fact that they've maxed out the area. That is rarely true. Rarely true. Unless you're in a very, 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 let me throw some more varies in there, very, 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 very rural area. That's really, really difficult to do. It's really difficult to do. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very difficult to do. So then we look at this and say, okay, but what happens then? Okay, well, one of the reasons why I would add a location. So let me tell you why I might add a location. I might add a location because we've maximized capacity of our current location. By the way, that's when you add capacity. When you maximize the current location. Now, you might ultimately decide to go build a bigger location and then move your current practice into that location, or you might end up saying, hey, I've got a practice here. I'm going to leave the current one in place, and then I'm going to bring new patients in, but I'm going to open up 8. So I just got brought into a conversation yesterday. A doctor's wanting to maximize the location. So we're going to put 18 operatories in that location, and that's going to max out that location. So then we're like, the whole point is like, and then we looked at the math on the 18 operatories plus the current location and said, okay, well, would this provide you financially with what you want? And said, okay. Well, then what we're going to do is we're going to maximize that location. And he doesn't really want a third location. Now, he might change his mind. But ultimately speaking, we got a second location for one reason, to increase capacity. Not to increase ego, but to increase capacity. So the question is, are you increasing it to increase capacity? Is that the goal? Is that the goal? Is it to increase capacity? And if the goal is to increase capacity, then we do it. If it makes financial sense, then we can do it. If it goes into long-term goals that were already created, part of a strategic plan, we do it. But we don't do it because of ego. And we don't do it because of the fact that we're not maximizing our current location. We go back to our current location and say, look, already maximizing the current facility. You might have a runway, by the way. You might say, well, I'm going to run out of this potential within the next 12 months, especially if I'm working with Eric. I'll run out of runway. That's fine. We might start looking at the next location. And we might maximize that, but it's not as simple as saying, first of all, it's easier to have one location. Look, if you're going to have a scalable operation, having one location, having the culture, having operations, having associates, having scalability, like all those things are, of course, easier for one location. Of course they are. That's like a no-brainer. And so, but if we want multiple locations, so I'm trying to say is this, I think people are focusing on the wrong thing. We might end up with multiple locations. We might. But we end up with multiple locations because of the fact that we're trying to grow capacity. While we're trying to grow capacity, we might have an acquisition of a practice, that is in another location, which already has so many operatories in it. And by adding that location, we're increasing our overall capacity as an organization, and then we maximize that one. And that might be locked too. We can only put so many operatories in that building, and then we might acquire another practice.
And I think the most important point you made was at the very beginning of the podcast when you said you need to have these things like in line. So am I maxed out capacity before I start looking at a second location? Because we have the conversations all the time where a doctor's saying, yeah, I'm looking at the second location, and they're not even open up on Fridays at their current practice. So you find yourself asking, okay, and he goes down to, is this an ego thing, or is this because you can't physically see any more patients in your building?
It's the same thing with associates. So look, I get doctors sometimes that come to say, well, I've had an associate that didn't work out, and the reason why it won't work out is because they brought an associate in before they were ready. You bring in an associate in to increase capacity, not to pull back. Say that again. You bring in an associate in to increase capacity because you have so many patients that you don't know where to put them. That's when you bring an associate, not because you want to get to pull back. If you do it because you want to pull back, what will happen is your income will go down because you probably haven't done the math on it. When your income goes down, you'll ultimately say, I don't want to give him or her these patients. When that happens, the associate gets frustrated. You start telling the associate, now be a marketing director, which doesn't make any sense at all. And now all of a sudden, this person is making less income than they were. They're frustrated. The operation's not. Look, you can start seeing.
And then you get on the phone and you're like, I didn't have an associate. It didn't work out.
This is a mess, right? No. What we do is we increase the growth in patients, both current patients and new patients, and we increase it to the point where we have nowhere else to put them. We open up our hours. We have providers to go see them. And then we can pull back. Mm-hmm. We pull back because we replace ourselves, okay? Yeah. And we replace ourselves over a period of time through a strategy. And it's not just, and that's what ends up happening is a lot of doctors bring associates in when they're not ready. Sometimes people take locations on when they're not ready. One of the reasons that we spend so much time in capital management, because this is all part of a financial plan. Mm-hmm. My first question when I sit down with the doctor is, what do you want? Mm-hmm. What do you want? What do you want life to look like? Then we work around the financial math on that because I'm going to tell you now, I don't know anyone else in the marketplace, period. No one's ever proved me wrong. And I'm not trying, that's not an ego thing. It's just the truth. I don't know anyone else in the entire dental marketplace in the United States of America coaching doctors on how to make capital investments. I don't know anybody else. Mm-hmm. Someone tell me, that's fine. You can tell me that person. I've never met them ever. No one's ever raised their hand and said, I know a person. So no one's coaching doctors on how to make capital investments. So first, what do you want? Right? Why do you want it? Then let's create a capital plan around that, a capital management plan. Then we start making strategic investments. We capture the ROI on that. And then part of that overall plan, what might be, we need to increase capacity. By looking at needing to increase capacity, one of those things might be to add another location because you're maximized, landlocked, however you want to call it, at your current location, and you can only build so much. So we ultimately are going to take on a new location. That location might replace the current one because it adds more operatories, or it might end up, because in that case it would cannibalize, or what ends up happening is we keep two locations. And then ultimately you might have your people that work with me start to get very ambitious, and then you might want another practice, another practice, another practice, because you're like, hey, Eric taught me how to do this. It's pretty scalable and fun. Yeah. And I might want 5 practices.
And I think the key point is, like, before you even do any of this, is figuring out who you're going to ask. Like, so as soon as you say, second location, like you mentioned, as soon as you go tell somebody second location, you're going to have people calling you and saying, hey, yeah, I found a piece of land that could do this. I got this great practice over here that you could just acquire really quickly, do the deal really fast. You need to find that person that you can call and say, hey, this is why I'm doing this, and you need to look, and then they're going to look objectively at it and say, all right, well, what's your capacity look like? Do you have the team in place to do this? Why are you doing this? Just like what you're saying. Oftentimes, doctors don't have that person to go to. You need to find that person to go to.
Right, which that's what I was saying, that's the lack. There's a need. So ultimately speaking, it's not a question of multiple locations or single location. Look, we could all say like one location would be much easier. One location, 32 ops, there you go. Yep. Boom, answer. No, look, that's more difficult to do in so many ways because you have to be willing to, that's a whole nother set of challenges. But single locations, of course, easier than multiple locations because everything's right there. Okay, you don't have to drive to one location. The team's used to working together. We can make. I have a piece of paper in front of me. We can make 48 reasons why single makes more sense, and I think anyone listening could understand that. What I'm saying is, ultimately speaking, is oftentimes multiple location is an ego and driven by people who make a lot of money on you buying a second location. People buy them prematurely, just like they hire associates prematurely. And so the first step is, it's not a question of single versus multiple. The question is why? Why am I expanding? Why am I adding another location? And if the answer is not capacity, then something's wrong with the way you're looking at this. It should be about capacity. And if it's not a capacity situation, now you might say, well, it's a fire sale, Eric, because it's a fire sale. I hear what he's saying, but man, they're selling this thing cheap. It's super cheap. Let me tell you what, if it's super cheap, you get what you pay for, and you're probably going to end up getting a mess, okay? Well, I heard I can make tons of money over there. Because I already know what's coming. Here
we go again.
You know how many calls I've gotten? Oh, it's a sale. Good gosh. Yeah. And ultimately, that's the same doctor who calls me 6 months later and goes, holy crap, this thing is struggling. And so, look, I get it. But even let's play that out. It should be. I found a fire sale. I'm super excited. I think I can get it at a good price, and they're not maximizing capacity. I'm going to add this. It's in a different area than mine, so I'm still going to focus on maximizing my own capacity, but it's going to increase my capacity as an organization. And because they're only open 3 days a week from 8 to 5 because they have 1963 hours, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to then open that up, and by increasing capacity there, what's going to end up happening is my overall organization will increase capacity. On top of that, I'll increase the capacity of that organization because there's unlimited potential, not unlimited, but there's potential that's not being taken advantage of, which means there's unrealized revenue. I'm going to go capture the unrealized revenue.
Boom.
That was like long. That was a lot. In that. I get like pumped up over here. So I think everybody needs to look at that. I just think it's understanding that scalable part of this, right? I think what people need to raise, I think maybe the point of this podcast is this. Look, you have to ask yourself why you're doing that. If you don't have a strategic plan for growing, why are you growing? What is by the way, you should know an exit strategy as you grow. By the way, you should know an exit strategy. What is your exit strategy? Why are you trying to grow? What are you trying to get to? Why are you trying to get there? And you should have a capital plan. If your financial advisor gave you your business plan, take it, rip it up in the air, shred it up, throw it in the trash. Because your dental practice is doing 30% and the stock market is doing like 5%. Stop. Get rid of that. Go back and say, we need to invest in the dental practice. Where do we need to invest? What's the highest ROI? What comes first? By the way, you better know what's first, second, and third because it does matter. You have to have a strategic plan around that. And if you have the strategic plan, you will find that the multiple locations will come by executing the plan. We don't get multiple locations and then try to create a plan. If you start executing a capital management plan, you will find the multiple locations come. No matter what, because you'll eventually need capacity. As you start increasing capacity and you have a scalable business, then people will start coming out of the woodwork asking you to buy their practice. But then what ends up happening is because you understand when, where, how, why, you'll understand whether you should take on that practice and whether it meets your success criteria. And by doing that, you'll be in a much better position to turn things down when you should turn them down, accept them when you need to accept them, and make better offers. Here's one thing I'll tell you. When people are desperate, they make bad financial decisions. When people get emotional, they make bad financial decisions. By having a plan in place, it removes the emotional component of the conversation. And now you can have an intellectual conversation, removing the emotional side and using logic instead. And by utilizing that, you'll tend to make a much better decision. One that might not, because you could lose $1 million, $2 million if you make the wrong decision. On the reverse side of that, you have the potential to gain a few $1 million. Maybe ultimately speaking, $10, $20 million. So it's really,
it's important.
I mean, like I said, this is a. If I've lost you on this podcast, which I think there's probably like a good 100 people who just turned off the podcast and were like, I don't know what he's talking about. Look, we could get as deep as you guys want to go on this, but I think ultimately speaking, don't use ego. Like, don't go buy a practice because of ego. Create a financial plan, create a strategic plan around it. Know why you're creating the strategic plan. One of those partners came in, I looked at him and I said, look, how are you going to walk into a bank right now? Yeah. And I say, and by the way, they came to me because they were like, we heard you could take us to 100 million. And I said, I can, but why do you want to do that? So ultimately what happens is, like I said, if you're sitting in front of a bank right now and they're saying, great, you want to borrow some money from us. What are you doing? We want to go to 100 million. Why do you want to do that? I don't know. Well, what's your capital management strategy? We don't have one. Well, why do you want a 10th location? Sounds good. Yeah. Then ultimately speaking, that's not, and it's like I was telling to those partners that day, I said, look, that's not a plan. Like, that's not, no one's going to give you capital with that kind of a strategy. You need to understand the strategy, but you need to do it for yourself as a CEO. So that is a long-winded answer. And I guess the answer ultimately is it depends. Yeah. Single location is easier to manage. Multiple locations should come out of a strategy. And it's part of something that will happen no matter what. If you're executing your plan properly, it tends to happen. If you're in a growth mode and you ultimately have a larger growth strategy, it's going to tend to happen. So don't sweat so much how many locations you have. First, create the plan, execute the plan. Multiple locations will come out of part of that plan, if that makes sense. Yep. So, well, anything else, Matthew?
That was it. I mean, I got some good stuff that we'll bring up for next time. I mean, I think once we look into that, we dive into one of the next podcasts. We talk about like how do you do if you do have multiple locations, how do you set up not necessarily a hierarchy, but how do you set up the overall operations of that organization? I had that conversation come up when we were talking about doing multiple locations, and the person already had multiple locations, but they just didn't know how to set up there's multiple partners in there. Who do you turn to? Who's the main, how do you put out the main figurehead in the practice?
Who's in charge?
So who's in charge? And I think that's a great segue into the next one.
Awesome. Well, we can talk about that next time. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Always glad to have you here. Same thing I'll tell you. I say it on every podcast, but I'm hoping that if I say it enough, you'll go and do it. Look, share this with somebody. There's so many doctors that are struggling with the same exact question, and they're thinking through the exact same, the exact same situation. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's a friend, or maybe this will come up down the road. Look, I would take a podcast like this, be a serious student, sit down. I'm literally, the amount of time that I've spent to gain the knowledge that I have is incredible. Just like you've put in it to become a great dentist. And so I need you to take this information and go share it. Do share this. Have a conversation with someone, because you get to hear it again when you start having this conversation. One of the things that serious students do is they share, because you listen to it and then you share it, you hear it again. And then if you end up having a group conversation, you might hear it a third time. That stuff starts to ingrain. Another thing that starts to happen is you start to get emotional, because by the time when you start to get, and that emotion might be excitement over the future growth of your company. And what happens is that whole conversation, like, what were you doing on September 11th, 2001? Well, we all know what we were doing. What were you doing on September 10th, 2001? No one has a clue, because emotion locks in memory. And so what happens is when you take content like this and you have conversations in a group, and then you start to feel excited about the strategies, what happens is it starts to lock in your memory, and it starts to lock into your bank. So when I tell you to get together, it's a strategy to lock this information in. And so by having group conversations, whether it be with your partners, whether it be with your DSO, whether it be with your small, with your dental friends, whomever, what ends up happening is when you start having these conversations, it starts locking this information in. So make sure you're doing that. Hey, look, and I will just also say, as a personal request, look, please like and share this. I mean, go on YouTube and subscribe. Look, it reinforces our desire to be here and continue to provide amazing content. It'd be a favor to me, so thank you for doing that. Like it, share it. I appreciate everyone for being here every week. The numbers are incredible. Keep it up. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.